Next speaker, who is Corey Bell. He works for Biosecurity Queensland and his current role focuses on weed and pest animal management in Cape York and Torres Strait. He works closely with a number of local governments and other key stakeholders such as Indigenous ranger groups, other state government departments and natural resource management groups to minimise the impacts of weeds and pest animals, and I presume we're talking about cats here, through planning, capacity building, facilitating and coordinating. He's also involved in the implementation of the Biosecurity Act as one of a team of trainers who are developing and delivering Biosecurity Act training to staff and stakeholders in the lead up to the introduction of the Act on the 1st of July next year. Prior to his current role, he was managing specific programs for electric ants, yellow crazy ants and Asian honeybees in Cairns. I'd like to hear about your bite history. He has also worked on a range of emergency biosecurity responses, including equine influenza and red witchweed, over his 9 years employment with Biosecurity Queensland. He holds a Master's in Environmental Science, in Geographic Information Science, sorry, I've got emails coming over here, with a Bachelor also in Environmental Science. He also holds a Certificate 4 in Frontline Management and currently finishing off Certificate 4 in Workplace Training and Assessment. You're a bit of an overachiever there, Corey. So that's it. Welcome, and I think you've worked out how things are operating here. So
got handwritten.
Right.
Bunch of stuff. With that bio, you're probably wondering what it is that I'm doing here. And it's a fair question, but there's two main reasons. The first one is, domestic animals escape, and often when they escape, they become pests. So they're things like cats, we've just heard a lot about, dogs, deer, horses, and when they escape, they go on to cause significant environmental, agricultural, social harm. The other reason why I'm here is often in local governments, especially small ones, the person who's the pest management officer, the local laws, domestic animals side, is also the pest management officer looking after weeds and pests. So the new, we've got a new piece of legislation called the Biosecurity Act coming in 2016. Today I'll try to answer some obvious questions that people generally have. Why are we having new legislation? What's it about? What's changed from the previous legislation? And what does it mean to me? So the new Biosecurity Act has been developed on the basis of real experiences so that it provides practical solutions to challenges that Biosecurity Queensland and local governments have faced in the past. This includes a range of flexible legislative tools designed to provide operational staff with better methods of dealing with complex biosecurity risks. It also brings the full range of biosecurity legislation under one consistent banner. It replaces 6 acts, makes substantial amendments to a few others, and replaces 11 pieces of subordinate legislation. It's a lot of legislation coming into one document, one act, and bringing diverse sort of groups together. But for our department and for local governments, it provides a consistency of powers and should simplify work practices. Finally, the Biosecurity Act is more in line with contemporary legislation, so it's all risk-based decision-making. In other words, we're focusing on the outcome rather than prescribing activities that people must or must not undertake. So that ultimately gives the state and local governments flexibility to deal with not just risks that we're already aware of, but new risks as they come in. And previously, sometimes we've had to wait to new regulations are passed to deal with new pests that come into the state or the country. So what does it encompass? The Biosecurity Act covers a full spectrum of biosecurity risks facing Queensland, and the term used in the legislation is Biosecurity Matter, and that covers, that's defined in the Act as a living thing other than a human or a part of a human, a pathogenic agent that can cause disease in a living thing other than a human, that affects a human by transmission from an animal. That'd be things like Hendra virus would be captured in there, a disease, a contaminate. It's also important that a carrier is also regulated, so things that can spread or move by a security matter, so a vehicle transporting weed seeds, a cow spreading ticks, even boots carrying a fungus. So invasive plants and animals are obviously included in here as living things, and in the Act they're referred to as invasive biosecurity matter. So while the Act has broader application than local government's role in the past, local government's role in the future is not going to change significantly, because they will still just be involved in the invasive biosecurity matter, so the weeds and pest animal side of things. So the Act's been developed on the basis of three foundational principles: risk-based decision-making, shared responsibility, and the precautionary principle. So shared responsibility recognises that to effectively support biosecurity in Queensland, everyone who deals with a biosecurity risk has a responsibility to contribute to its management or mitigation. This is formalised through the General Biosecurity Obligation and recognition of intergovernmental and industry agreements. So it's about putting the responsibility of managing the risk to those that own the risk. So risk-based decision-making, this, like I mentioned previously, this is about transitioning from focusing on prescribing what people must do to setting a benchmark or setting an outcome that people have to achieve, and leaving it up to them to achieve that in a way that best suits the situation, their business, all those sort of things. So under previous legislation, responses to defined biosecurity threats were strictly prescribed. This could mean that biosecurity officers and individuals were required to undertake steps which may not have represented the best approach for those circumstances. And we've seen that and learnt that in previous biosecurity situations, and we've learnt and improved it in this new legislation. There will be some high risk or common management requirements that will still be prescribed, but the aim of risk-based decision making is to ensure that only the most necessary and effective steps are taken to manage biosecurity risks. This approach of risk-based decision making is new in biosecurity in Australia, but it's been used in other government areas, and you're probably familiar with the Animal Care and Protection Act and the Workplace Health and Safety Act. They're risk-based decision-making, risk-based legislation as well. So the third foundational principle is the precautionary principle. So previous legislation delayed responses to biosecurity incursions until a scientific identification had been completed, and in the case of new incursions, sometimes an amendment to legislation needed to be made. This poses obvious problems and slowed down our response capacity to when a new disease, a new pest, a new threat came in. To overcome this issue, we'll use the precautionary principle, which states when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. So it'll allow us to take action where there's serious or irreversible damage is possible, but the scientific knowledge is incomplete. So significant obligations, there's a range of them, and the first and probably most flexible and important one is the general biosecurity obligation. We'll talk about that a bit later. prohibited and restricted matter obligations, and then there's requirements for registration of designated animals for disease tracing and management purposes. There's some notification requirements with associated biosecurity events and a range of specific indicators such as high morbidity rates, unexpected crop failures and unacceptable contaminant levels. Then there's prohibition on the feeding of animal matter to certain animals, as this can spread disease. So that's swill feeding type stuff there. So the general biosecurity obligation, prohibited and restricted matter obligations are the only areas of the Act that local governments will be required to manage, and that will be in respect to weeds and pest animals within their local government area. So the general biosecurity obligation provides the greatest level of flexibility, and it's a universal obligation that requires all persons who deal with biosecurity matter or a carrier, if they know or ought reasonably to know that it poses a biosecurity risk, to take all reasonable and practical measures to prevent or minimise the risk. It's impossible for us to prescribe what a person must do in every circumstance, so this obligation allows us to deal with a more diverse range of biosecurity risks threatening industry, environment, economic interests, human health, social amenity. In the lead up to the introduction of the Act, local governments will be provided with more information on the GBO and how it should be applied. Prohibited matter is something that's not found in Queensland, but could have serious impacts if it entered the state. Prohibited matter must generally not be dealt with unless otherwise authorised by a permit. If found, it's got to be reported to an inspector within 24 hours, and the prohibited matter is listed in Schedule 1. They've listed some examples there. Hericier cactus is something that is already in Queensland, but they're referring to, there's different species of Hericier cactus, so they're referring to the species that aren't already in Queensland. Restricted matter. So restricted matter includes pests and weeds that are already here, but management's required to reduce their impacts. They're listed in Schedule 2 of the Act, and they must be dealt with according to the restricted matter categories that have been assigned. So the Act includes 7 categories, which are assigned to the restricted matter based on the plant's biology, ecology, and the types of risk that needs to be managed. So Category 1 and 2, these pose the most significant threat and have a specific and urgent reporting requirement, whether or not they're in a person's possession. So Category 1 and 2 relate to high-risk diseases, pathogens or species that are not widespread and will have a significant impact if they are not managed immediately. So there's no invasive biosecurity matter, weeds or pest animals as Category 1, but there are Category 2. So Category 2 restricted matter must be reported to an authorised officer within 24 hours. Category 3 to 7. So Category 3 includes invasive species, invasive animals and plants where deliberate distribution or disposal is a key source of spread. So this is essentially restricting sale of pests. Category 4 includes invasive plants and animals that mustn't be moved to stop their spread into other areas. Category 5 restricted matter cannot be possessed or kept under a person's control, as this restricted matter has a high potential to become a pest and has a capacity to impact heavily on the environment. Category 6 restricted matter cannot be fed unless held under a restricted matter permit. Category 7 must be killed as soon as practicable and disposed of in a way described under regulation. So at the moment, the only thing in Category 7 is noxious fish. So things like if you catch a tilapia, already there's a requirement that you dispose of it straight away. just because somebody fulfills their obligations under these categories with respect to restricted matter doesn't mean that that's necessarily all they need to do. They will still have their general biosecurity obligation that may require them to take further steps as well. So we've got a whole series of instruments that we can use under the Biosecurity Act. Starting at the top gives us the most power with the emergency orders, and then moving down, by the time we get to the biosecurity orders, that's when we're dealing with sort of management of species that are here and will probably always be here. So I hope there's no engineers here, because those cogs just would never work. So forgive me for that. But biosecurity emergency orders, these are designed to deal with really serious biosecurity events that are currently happening or may happen unless action's taken. And these can only be issued by the Chief Executive of a state government, and they need to have reasonable grounds for taking such significant action. Powers of authorised officers under these provisions are quite significant, and include the capacity to appoint police officers to stop and inspect vehicles, inspectors to enter a place without permission, destroy matter, biosecurity matter or carriers, and take other steps to minimise the serious risks. So these can only be run for a maximum of 21 days, and they'd be used for things like foot and mouth disease, the really serious stuff. So movement control orders can last up to 3 months, and they're designed to provide an interim measure while regulations are being developed, identifying biosecurity zones. So these are used where the impact of a pest can be managed by reducing spread of biosecurity matter or the carriers. Biosecurity zone regulations include arrangements for managing or reducing or eradicating regulated biosecurity matter in relation to the biosecurity zone, and may be applicable over an extended period of time or indefinitely. They can be established across the whole of the state or part of the state. At this stage, we're uncertain whether we'll use these for weeds and pest animals, but at the moment it's proposed that they'll use them for things like cattle ticks, where currently we've got a tick line, and there'll be cattle tick zones. Biosecurity programs. These are when the next two slides, biosecurity programs, biosecurity orders, will be able to be used by local governments, and these are for non-emergency situations. So it's about identifying, responding to a pest or disease that poses a significant biosecurity risk still. Once a program is established, authorised officers have additional powers of entry and control that are not available under normal circumstances. So these can be authorised by the Chief Executive of the state or the Chief Executive of the local government. And the biosecurity programs are in two main sections: surveillance program and prevention and control. So surveillance is about ensuring compliance with the Act, or confirming the presence or absence of a pest, or determine its extent. Prevention and control program can be used to prevent the entry, the establishment or spread of a pest in a matter, or to manage, control or eradicate. Biosecurity orders, these can be used to enforce the general biosecurity obligation, and can be used by local government authorised officers. So if an officer believes that a person has failed or may fail to discharge their general biosecurity obligation, then they may issue a biosecurity order. The order may include action the recipient must take to discharge their general biosecurity obligation, and a time when the authorised officer will come back and check that they have done it. They need to be issued in writing, and a record needs to be kept of those in an official register. So local government enforcement capacity. It's expected that the role of local government with regard to invasive plants and animal management will not change significantly, but there are a range of new enforcement tools available. As highlighted in the previous slide, authorised officers will be able to issue biosecurity orders. There'll be the option to use infringement notices, and for more serious breaches, there's an opportunity to, for legal action associated with a range of offences listed in the Act. In addition to that, there'll still be the opportunity for local government to have specific invasive species management requirements in their local laws. Although regional priorities identified in their local government biosecurity plan, we used to call those pest management plans, but biosecurity plan, same thing. By identifying priorities in there, you're going to place a general biosecurity obligation on those people in those areas to take action about those pests. So that's an alternate way to deal with pests that aren't listed as restricted or prohibited matter in the legislation. So further information will be available in the lead up to the introduction of this Act. So between now and July next year. Many of the regulations and policies with the Act are still under development, but as relevant information comes to hand, we'll communicate that with local governments. Of particular importance will be the Biosecurity Act Training, which is currently under development. Any BQ or local government staff who need to be appointed under this legislation will have access to training to ensure that they have the skills, knowledge needed by the time the Act comes into force. There's general information available on our website, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube accounts. And if you have any direct questions, you can ask them now or get in touch with your local biosecurity officer.